1980s, the early 1990s, television was just filled with a lot of crap, you know.
Hello and welcome to Flyover Culture, your guided tour to pop culture in the Midwest. I'm Peyton Whaley. Theodore Roosevelt once had some choice words about the man in the arena. But I saw Teddy Roosevelt's letterbox and it sucked, so who cares what Mr. Mustache thinks? So today we're here to talk with one of my favorite critics, Eric Deggans. Eric is NPR's first TV critic and has been in the game for a while now. Plus, he was in Bloomington recently to teach a class, so I had him stop by the studio for a little chat. Here's what he had to say. Eric, thanks so much for coming in this morning.
Thanks for having me.
Do you mind just kind of introducing yourself and what you do for the folks at home?
I cover television and media for National Public Radio. That means I appear on all the broadcasts, I write stuff for the website, I analyze media, which means sometimes I might talk about things that aren't television, but are considered media, and I also occasionally guest host shows. So, I've guest hosted All Things Considered on the weekend a few times.
How'd you get involved with NPR? How did you get down this path of becoming a TV critic?
I knew I wanted to be a journalist, and I knew I wanted to study at the best school that I could afford. And at that time, I grew up in Gary. Indiana University had one of the best journalism schools in the country. So I came here, I studied journalism, and realized that I wanted to be a pop music critic. That was my real passion back then. I did that for a while for papers in New Jersey and Florida, and then became a TV critic. Realized that National Public Radio didn't really cover TV that much. They would have people come in and talk about stuff, but they didn't have a staffer in-house. So I went to one of the editors that I met at a journalism conference and just sort of said, you guys really should have more stuff about television. Now this would have been 2010, so this was before Netflix had original shows and before we really had the streaming revolution. But we had a lot of stuff on cable TV. TV was still a really powerful force in society. So as a freelancer, I would contribute, a few stories a month. And then it got to the point where I was doing a story a week. It's been a long road. But I've been a TV critic for a long time, since 1997.
He saw the kind of weight TV was carrying at the time and the potential in writing about it. During that time, you said, it was before streaming, before the whole peak TV thing of it all. But I mean, yeah, it seems like if there's any decade to really get into TV, it's the mid-2000s of you've got the reality TV revolution, you've got all these, all the HBO stuff going on.
Absolutely. Television had always been an important force in pop culture, but it was moving to the center of pop culture in a way that we really hadn't seen before. I would say the mid-80s, the late 1980s, the early 1990s, television was just filled with a lot of crap. Even after, of course, it was. But you started to see the emergence of what we now think of as quality television. We started to see shows like Oz on HBO and Homicide: Life on the Street. Then The Sopranos comes along and Sex and the City, and that kind of explodes cable. And we start to see higher quality shows outside of the broadcast universe, and we see people taking chances in ways that maybe they wouldn't have when TV was more formulaic. And then there's this sense that cable can kind of do anything.
And it did, for a while. In the early 2010s, a cable subscription was enough to get you shows like Breaking Bad and Mad Men, and if you had HBO, congrats on your tax bracket. And if you had Starz, you didn't exist. No one had Starz. But the thing about the peak TV era is that you can't stay on a peak forever. It's pointy and hard to breathe.
Instead, what happened was that streaming kind of fragmented the whole TV universe to the point where there's no one place you can go where you can see everything. And in a way that's good because it allows for a lot of different voices to bubble up. But in a way it's tough because now the consumer has to keep track of all this stuff and people are just confused. They're not, they hear about a show, they don't know where it is. I think what's happening now is that we have a lot of mid-TV. We have a lot of TV that's okay and maybe a little better than okay. And there's so much pressure to find things to celebrate that people will celebrate things that are really not great.
And of course now the life cycles of those shows are so short too.
Yeah, but in a way, I think it's just a recognition that for most shows, the storyline can't sustain for much longer than 4 seasons and still be a valid show and not feel like they're just beating a dead horse. All due respect to Grey's Anatomy, but I feel like I've seen every permutation of a medical emergency that's possible on that show.
Eric says the shift to a more scattershot streaming landscape has meant the slow death of all things, the pilot episode.
Streamers want you to watch as many episodes as possible. So they will not set the mission statement of the show in the first episode, because no matter how good it is, there is a percentage of viewers who will say, well, I'm not interested in that, and they'll stop watching. So they will delay big moments until the third episode or the fourth episode or the sixth episode. With the Lord of the Rings series that was on Amazon Prime, you had to watch the whole first season to even understand what the show was about. With House of the Dragon, in the second season, you didn't really get an exciting, galvanizing episode until the fourth episode.
That sounds...
It's insane. It's insane. And House of the Dragon and the Lord of the Rings series, they're releasing these episodes week to week. It's not like they're releasing them all at once for people to binge watch even.
Right.
So you've got to spend week and week and week and week until you finally get to something that happens. So that has complicated my job.
Now we know the TV landscape. So how do we tackle it? I want to circle back to basics and just talk about, the art of being a critic. In your experience, putting it super generally, what makes a good critic?
A good critic is a good storyteller, because ultimately what you're doing is you have an artistic experience, and then you're trying to figure out how to critique that artistic experience in a way that moves your audience. That's ultimately the goal. I'm going to tell you a story about this story that informs you about whether or not this thing is any good, whether or not it's significant, whether or not it's saying something about society. And that's the thing that's different between being a critic and being a fiction writer. A fiction writer has to come up with all of the material on their own. Critics, we are provided an experience, and then we're trying to figure out how to translate that experience into something that will both inform people about whether or not they want to engage with that art, teach them a little bit about why they should care about this thing at all, and then ultimately be entertaining in its own right. Even if you always disagree with me, that's valuable too. I used to regularly read Gene Siskel, who was this legendary film critic who worked for the Chicago Tribune. I grew up in Gary, very close to Chicago. I was much more a Roger Ebert guy. Those two guys had a show called Sneak Previews. He was much more populist. Gene Siskel was much more sort of elite. But he was such a good critic that I knew I could read his reviews. I could get a sense of what that artistic experience was like. And if he liked it, then I knew I probably wouldn't like it. And if he hated it, I knew I'd probably like it. And that's fine.
Yeah, he was your North Star for things you knew you would hate.
Exactly.
Criticism isn't always about solely entertaining your audience or saying thing good, thing bad.
What is this really about? I mean,
well, it's about love. It's about a lot of things.
It's about acquiring Pokemons.
Sometimes you can help people think about art in a way they hadn't before.
I did a story a few years ago where a bunch of black people who had been on Survivor banded together to talk about how much harder the show is for people who are not white because of how the show is put together. I remember seeing the very first edition of Survivor, the very first season, and then I went to a press party. And I went up to Mark Burnett, the guy who executive produced the show and created the American version. I said to him, I noticed some troubling racial dynamics on the show. And he jumped back like I was trying to touch him with a hot poker and denied it and refused to discuss it. When I wrote a book about race and media in 2012, I tried to get him to talk to me. He agreed to answer questions via email, but he wouldn't talk to me in the moment. And so when I saw a dozen black people who'd been on the show get together and agree to talk to me and other people about how much harder that experience was for them because they felt the show was inherently racist. I felt so gratified, and I felt like this thing that I noticed 20 years ago is still happening. That's unfortunate, but I was right. And anybody who listened to me when I talked about the show back then learned something that maybe helped them decide either to not watch the show or to watch the show with better eyes. And that's the job. That is ultimately the job.
So you want to be a critic. You want to capture the spirit of a piece of art and entertain your audience in the process. How do you do that?
I experience a thing. I don't really take notes. I mean, in my head, I will note things. Oh, that's interesting. That might be something I want to talk about. But for the most part, what I want to do is just have that artistic experience.
Yeah, you want to be present, have it kind of just wash over you?
I want to just, ultimately, the biggest question I always have is, did this thing really move me or did it not? So I'm just looking for that moment. And sometimes that moment happens in the first episode, sometimes it happens in the third episode. And I'm deciding whether or not it's significant enough to review and what kind of story can I tell about this thing.
We know it's a weird time to be a viewer and try to keep on top of the deluge of content. But don't worry, it's a weird time to be a critic too. We talked a lot about like how the landscape has changed, especially since you started covering TV. How has the critic's role in that landscape changed?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, what's happened is that a lot of media outlets have, laid off critics, eliminated critics' jobs. So many more critics are freelancers. And so it makes it harder to be a critic. It makes it harder because it's harder to earn a living. You have to hustle quite a lot, and it makes it harder to establish a career as a critic because you're constantly trying to convince people to rehire you. It's created a situation where it's easier to co-opt critics. Critics make less money. They're less financially independent. They don't have big institutions standing behind them. So it is easier for a studio or a publicity firm or someone who makes media with big money to come up and say, hey, I'll fly you to Morocco so that you can talk with the stars of this movie. And, by the way, we would love it if your review was favorable, And they don't often put it in such stark terms. But if somebody is flying you to a location to interview people from a movie, they don't expect you to trash the movie, right? And if you do, they're not going to fly you anywhere else because it is so hard for critics to make a living. It is easier and easier for these big institutions to co-opt them and create these situations where they cover the cost of being a critic. They may not expect favorable coverage, but they at the very least expect that you will not negatively review these things. It would be nice to see more media outlets hire critics because I think that would help criticism. It would make it easier for people to be independent and easier for them to write negative reviews or at the very least sort of ignore things because they won't be taking trips or they won't be at these glitzy receptions and they won't feel pressured to give good reviews to things that are attached to really powerful entities. There is this sense that if you're inviting people who have not necessarily been trained in journalism, who don't necessarily have the independence, they're not working for a big institution, so
don't have an editor to check them.
They don't have an editor to check them, but they also don't have the protection of a big institution.
Yeah.
Then all of a sudden, your podcast is dead or your vlog is dead. And it's really hard in those kind of formats where you're counting on views to make your money. It's really hard to tell people things they don't want to hear. And that's why, institutions like NPR and the New York Times and the Washington Post, that's why they're so important. Because we have the ability to endure negative public reaction. We have the ability to tell people things they don't want to hear or say, we think it's most important to tell this story in this way. You may want us to say this and this. We cannot do this because we have our ethical standards. We have our way of doing things that we think serves our audience best. And this is how we're going to do it. New voices bring new processes, new ways of thinking. They shatter, rules that don't make sense. But the institutions bring the ability to endure negative responses and bring experience and codes of ethics that I think are really important when you're talking to people about and helping them decode all of these messages in media that are trying to sell them something, that are trying to manipulate them into voting one way or another. Media literacy is nowhere near where it needs to be in America, which is surprising because we're drowning in media. And so I think that it's up to the audience, really, to realize how much power it has and take the initiative to educate itself about how this works. Because otherwise you'll always be a patsy. You'll always be controlled by someone else or manipulated by someone else or fooled by someone else. And ultimately, what I want is an audience that is smart and educated enough that no one can manipulate them. I do think we're in a moment, we're still in a moment where the audience doesn't realize the power that it has.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it. Eric, thank you so much for doing this. Eric Deggans, TV critic for NPR and media analyst. Eric, do you want to tell the people where they can follow you and read your work?
Sure. So you can go to @Deggans on X/Twitter if you're still on that hellscape. You can find my website is www.ericdeggans.com. You can also find me on NPR.org. We have a little search tab at the top of our website.
And make sure you are subscribed to Flyover Culture so you don't miss new episodes when they come out every month. And leave your critic's review of this episode down below, but you have to be nice. That's the rule. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Great rule.
In this one, they fight for an hour, and then they have a message at the end about how fighting is bad, but then they're going to have a sequel where they fight some more.